The Stanley Parable is one of my favourite video games of all time. It combines genius commentary on storytelling, video games, and decision making with incredibly effective comedy and genuinely emotional story beats. I first got this game not knowing anything about it, and it only took this line,
"Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago,"
to realise it was going to be one of my favourites. There are 19 endings in this game if you include the whiteboard ending, and there are so few duds that it's remarkable. Anyways, after that, they released the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, and everyone loved it, all except for me and Cookie9 apparently. The Ultra Deluxe was a remake that added 24 endings. It added a bunch of new content and revamped the visuals while keeping the old endings in the game. Most of these new endings follow the same path as the originals do, but you take a bucket with you, and they get a little bit altered. And look, don't get me wrong, the new content in the Ultra Deluxe is very good. It's above average in your standard game, but when you have to compare it to the original, the blemishes stick out like a sore thumb. I'd love to hear your take in the comments, because as far as I can tell, everyone else seems to love the new content. Anyways, with that out of the way, I figured it'd be nice to organise my thoughts on the game and rank all endings in the Stanley Parable cinematic universe. I included all endings with their bucket versions in this video. This includes the new content ending, sequel ending, skip button ending, all that stuff. That also includes the demo ending, which you should download on Steam right now and play if you haven't already. However, I didn't include the whiteboard ending because there isn't a game reset and nothing really happens there. Hey everyone, so I'm just adding this in after an hour and a quarter recording session. I didn't realize I missed two endings here. I missed the 2 anniversary updates, the Coward ending with the bucket and the Heaven ending with the bucket. So yeah, if those sections are a little bit underprepared, that's because I don't have the time. Alrighty, so grab your buckets, enter the door on your left, and let's get straight into ranking them. Before we keep going, I want to bring up something. The original Stanley Parable had great humour. There were really wacky scenarios that you couldn't see in any other game, and they made thematic sense. However, online, people would really only talk about the wacky scenario because you can't quote a theme. This, I think, led the game devs to believe that, oh, people must love the wackiness, let's do more of that, while losing the thematic purpose. Because of this, you get endings like our bottom one here, the elevator bucket ending. In the elevator bucket ending, Stanley goes up and down a bunch on an elevator, presses the number 3 because lol Lamau Ruffle, has a press conference exactly like the original ending, but no one shows up and it's really sad. So I think I'm missing something. I must be. There's no rhyme or reason here. There's no lesson to learn, no human to laugh at, no emotion to be gained. It's just making Stanley act intentionally stupid and having the narrator narrate those dumb things and expecting people to laugh. The punchline for this joke is that no one is interested in Stanley and he loses his only friendship. Is that supposed to uplift me? Is it supposed to make me think? Because it sure as hell doesn't. I mean, I don't get very emotional in fiction, so maybe it's supposed to make me feel sad? I genuinely don't understand the point here. I mean, it's probably about not being able to share your passion, but that's a serious and genuine topic. Why'd you have to combine it with such a thoughtless execution? Speaking of which, yeah, number 3, haha, press, that had a lot of thought put into it. Ultimately, I dislike quite a few of the bucket endings more than their original counterparts pretty consistently in this game, because they seem to take the insightful narration and subtle humour only to replace it with effortless absurdism. And while it does work in some endings, this is a perfect example of trying far too hard to be funny. Anyways, enough said, moving on. The broom closet ending without a bucket involves entering a completely inconspicuous room, treating it like it's super important, and having the narrator absolutely scold you for it. It's hilarious, and literally everyone loves it, and myself included. It's funny watching someone get angry at an idiot. In the bucket version, they make the narrator an idiot as well, so there's absolutely no balance. They took one of the funniest moments in gaming and morphed it into a game of make-believe you don't want to be a part of. What was the point here? You kept in the idiocracy, but missed the out-of-the-box ending structure. I just can't with this ending. I can't deal with this. This is a real outlier for the base game, but the escape pod ending is really not my thing. In this ending, you trigger the boss's door, but back up while it closes. This cuts off the narrator's speech, leading you downstairs, through a hallway and towards an escape pod. Once you reach it, the game resets. No narration, story, or humour. The ending doesn't do anything wrong because there was nothing in it to do wrong. The ominous theme of being cast stray from the narrator wears off pretty quickly, and you're only left with walking upstairs for the rest of the gameplay. Also, this didn't affect the ranking because it was fixed in Ultra Deluxe, but in the original game, it was so difficult to see where you were moving on the stairs because it was so dark, which sucked. But if we backtrack to the escape pod, This is unlike any other original game ending because it really says nothing. Even the powerful and cold feet endings let the narrator sarcastically mock you on your bad decision making. This one is just boring and too serious and literally cuts before anything interesting gets to happen. Moving on. The escape pod ending with the bucket is the exact same but with a few differences, because you get to wipe a tear from the bucket as it goes away, which is something that happens at least. Also, it's missing in the next playthrough, which is, yeah, it's actually pretty good. This one isn't nearly as bad as the bottom three, but it's still just a couple dialogue tweaks away from being the original ending. There's no real wit to be found here, or anything at all. Just some more bucket worship with the characters pretending to be kinda dumb. It's not awful, but I could just not see myself going back to it. The cold feet ending with the bucket is in a similar boat to the powerful bucket ending, but it's higher because the line,
"You can fall on a bucket from literally any height and survive,"
is sarcastic enough to work. But yeah, same commentary. Oh, the baby game ending. The idea of an ending that's just the worst gaming experience imaginable that results in you coming face to face with the god of art itself is honestly just hilarious. I can't realistically rank this ending any higher because it is the worst gaming experience imaginable, but boy do I love watching others play it. I love the auto-clicker safeguard and the absolutely disgusting sound effect every time you press the button that makes me want to claw my ears out. I love the fact that this could have so easily been a cop-out ending where you don't actually get to meet the essence of divine art, but lo and behold, it's just one of the stupidest things in the entire game, and I love it. I like the freedom ending with the bucket less than the baby game ending, but this is a serviceable ending. It's the same as the regular freedom ending, but the door closes because it doesn't want the bucket to leave. It just makes it feel like you got ripped off when the revamped version has the exact same narrative structure, except the ending was just flipped on its head. It's not the absolute worst, there's a fair enough reason for why the bucket can't leave that fits with the rest of the story, but honestly I just find myself being really uninterested in coming back to this ending most of the time. It doesn't say anything new and only technically works. The cold feet ending is okay, but there's again not too much to report. You trigger the cargo lift but back up before it leaves, so you just have to jump down into the car park. It feels much more like it was built around a bug the developers only found through playtesting. It's fun once you finally figure it out, because by the time you've tried this and you probably figured there weren't any more, but there's just not much to see here. The epilogue leaves a worse taste in my mouth than any other ending. This is the last part of the Ultra Deluxe, the final ending, the conclusion to all the horrors, emotion and wit that you've experienced. And what do we get from it? Well, we get a nice little callback to the skip button ending, a lot of backtracking, then a computer. At this computer, you talk to the text that gives you the sliders when you first boot up the game. This text then talks about how we should make more Stanley Parable games even if people hate them, then gives you some sliders. That's the end. Okay, we'll do the good things first. The visuals at the start are fantastic. You can collect the bucket from the escape pod ending. The gym buttons are quite humorous, and there's probably a message in there somewhere, but boy does this leave me feeling stranded. What do you mean, don't cling to it, let it burn? Are you sarcastically insinuating that you shouldn't make more Stanley Parable sequels? Because this is the ending of the Stanley Parable sequel you made. Are you making fun of cinematic universes and heartless cash grabs? Okay, that works. But is this the best execution you could think of? Sarcastic text? Why not do something a little more interactive, maybe a little more apocalyptic? You made the concept of unimportant parts of maps in gaming into one of the most memorable moments in your own game. Why did you stop bothering at the conclusion? Isn't that the most important part? I don't know, I guess the constantly changing number of Stanley Parables is pretty fun. And again, this isn't the worst possible scenario, but it just leaves so much to be desired. The tape ending is a little confusing, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's one of the three endings where I think the bucket version is better, and of those three, I think this one has the biggest change in quality. Number two, it adds a completely new path with an area that wasn't available in the original version of the game, so very enticing. Number three, it was so close to being an interesting ending, but then just forgot? Like, this could have been so good, but then they decided to take a half measure and only got a third of the way through. A sixth measure. In this ending, you get to the cargo lift, then climb the rail, jump down onto the plank path, and go through a vent. Once you get through this vent, you get to this hidden room with a tape recorder in it. From here, it seems like the narrator had just been on a tape this whole time, and there's a little moment of realization. However, after this, the real narrator comes back and calls you dumb for thinking that he was taped, and then reset. Are you starting to get my drift? This could have been a super fun, confusing ending where more things start being fake around you, or maybe a narrator lore drop. but it ends before anything can happen at all. Currently, the only two things that happen is A, the narrator is uncharacteristically mean towards you when he's usually just sarcastic but supportive, and B, they make fun of their own narrative structure and don't fix it. That's like cooking a burger with rats in it for your friends and then saying, "Oh my god, did you actually think I made you a rat burger? You're so dumb, I'm sad now." And they're not actually giving them anything. Like, they're hungry, feed them, or at least give them some takeaway. It doesn't have to be. Anyways, I got lost in the metaphor. This ending had a fantastic setup, but lived up to almost no standards, unfortunately.
The coward ending with the bucket is good, but there's definitely some problems that I have with its execution. I thought it was absolutely terrifying and incredibly impressive how well they managed to encapsulate the people who didn't like the Ultra Deluxe. That's a boat which I'm definitely in. A lot of the thoughts that I had about the Ultra Deluxe were perfectly mirrored in this one, and I find that incredible. Alongside this, I do kind of like the narrator's dialogue and where it goes, but there's just kind of a problem. This ending is all about making fun of the people who didn't like the Ultra Deluxe, but as one of those people, after looking through the ending, my opinion definitely hasn't changed. I don't want a new sequel or anything, but I don't think of the Ultra Deluxe more highly just after this 1-minute ending, and I think that's what it was going for. But maybe not. Ultimately, this ending is good, but not all too high. Oh, the heaven ending with the bucket. One of the ones that I forgot. So, I've just seen a video of this, and it seems to be pretty good. It seems to be very interesting, kind of dark, and the environment that you're transported to is actually pretty terrifying and interesting. Has a great ominous theme to it with great lighting and all of that. To get this ending, you need to do the exact same thing as the heaven ending, except when you get the phone call ringing, the door will stay open, and you can press the computer in your room. So after you do that, you get transported to this very creepy place, and I think it's pretty good. Not quite as good as the original heaven ending, but, you know, still nice. Speaking of the original heaven ending,
the heaven ending is pretty funny and actually has some gameplay, so pretty good. I know I'm complaining about a lot of these lower endings, but most of these have been subpar at worst, and you'll see pretty soon that when this game is good, it more than makes up for the blemishes. If we look back at this ending, saying that it's got gameplay and is somewhat funny seems like a backhanded compliment, but that comment doesn't consider the uniqueness and the future endings. In the heaven ending, you have to go around pressing a bunch of buttons on co-workers' computers, and once you do it enough times you get sent to this glowing place of beauty where you can press as many buttons as you want. The ending itself doesn't say too much, but it does play into the game's theme of, wait, you wanted a reward for this? And it does that pretty well, so no real complaints. An out-of-map ending with a bucket was going to be difficult to make. The original ending was mainly intriguing because it was difficult to find, but if you're trying it with the bucket, the novice is likely worn off. So how do you accurately capitalize on the premise without the intrigue? Well, the out-of-map ending with the bucket works pretty well with what it was given with. Once you get out, the bucket reveals its secrets, like how it's a war criminal and was turned into a bucket by a dark wizard, Gamborata. Stanley is devastated by this and kills the bucket in a surprisingly gruesome way, and then it resets. The idea of taking the bucket out of the map feels more like an excuse to put the ending in the game, but I do kind of like the ending. It has Stanley actually be a competent character, killing the bucket and losing his mind at the nonsense of the situation. The seriousness contrasted with the goofy premise works pretty well for a solely comedic ending, and the screenshot of the dead bucket has kind of become a staple of the game at this point. Nothing all too special here, but definitely a fun one. The bottom of the mind control facility is another, wait, you wanted a reward for this? Ending. I think this one is better than the heaven ending because this one has a rock song, and that's about it.
Good job, you made it to the bottom of the mind control facility.
I'm guessing Davey and William got a bunch of emails from people who are proud of the fact that they'd found a bug in their game and wanted to set things right. And that was done pretty well. The narrator is very condescending towards the player here, and while his babying way of talking in the Ultra Deluxe doesn't work quite as well for me as his matter-of-fact way of speaking from the original game, it's still a nice change of pace. A fine addition. The confusion ending with the bucket is confusing. On the one hand, all the old characters coming back and staging an intervention can be really funny. On the other hand, it starts to lose its way by the end. In this one, the other characters say that Stanley has spent too much time with the bucket, and so try to destroy it. But Stanley doesn't let that happen, and the bucket destroyer blows up. At the start, it's another fun little juxtaposition between a serious meeting, but with a broom closet and a mannequin. That was very funny. Also, more time with the line TM is always good. But once we actually get to the bucket destroyer, things start to unravel a little bit. I don't love how the game doesn't let you destroy the bucket at all. That goes against the choice-based nature of the game a bit, and I just feel like the entire ending could have centered around the previous characters and not this new one. As is, the ending has quite a bit of promise, but got somewhat lost by the end. The powerful ending is realistically on a similar pedestal as the cold feet ending. It has the exact same structure, but instead of being stranded, you willingly jump off the cargo lift. There isn't a real reason it should be this much higher. Except for these two. The first is theming. The general idea of the powerful ending is that you make every possible choice that goes against what the narrator says. Because of this, you die. I think that's just more interesting story-wise than triggering a platform and running back. It builds the idea that the narrator really dislikes you based on your decisions and is the crux of all the bad endings in the game. Second is video game nepotism. This was the first ending I got, the first time I got to experience the game's humor, and gee did I like it. So yeah, personal bias and an interesting story boosted this one up quite a bit. The museum ending with the bucket is pretty good, but has a couple of aspects I'm not the biggest fan of. In this one, the museum presents you with the history of buckets, and then tells you to let Stanley die so no more buckets have to be harmed. To get the bad stuff out of the way, I reckon the way the story ends with the voice telling the machine to kill Stanley is just another bucket worship ending, something which we get a lot of. Just gets a bit unoriginal. However, all of the exhibits are pretty hilarious, like the image of 25 buckets and the floating bucket. That kind of worked. It's ultimately just a less memorable version of its debucketed counterpart, but I do like the humor quite a bit. This one has a bit weaker premise than the tape ending without the bucket, but it executes its idea far better. In the tape ending with the bucket, you go through the same path that you did before, except when you get to the tape, it's a recording of someone you don't know rambling on about the bucket. He's gone insane analysing it and describes how much money people would pay for it. However, then we hear a monstrous creature in the recording going towards him, and it ends. I really like the acting here, especially considering this is one of the 4 voices in the entire game.
The longer I study this bucket, the less sense anything makes.
I also love how surprisingly dark this is, not just with the monster, who by the way is Gamborata, the wizard that made the bucket a bucket, but also with the addiction themes with how the tape speaks about the bucket. That sentence sounds really stupid, but this is the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe. This one goes for a much more cinematic approach than the other endings, which have either a wacky or kind of indie style. But I think the use of cutscenes, slow zooms, and intense background music really help with the feel for the ending. They're trying as hard as possible for you to take this silly scenario seriously, so either you don't and find it somewhat funny, or you do and have a nice mixture. Also, do any of you reckon that this is the bucket? The man on the tape has a bucket himself, so that could be the one that you have. However, Gamborata did attack him, so that kind of implies that the man himself is the bucket and the one who was speaking to you at the end of the out-of-map bucket ending. Just a fun idea. Onward! In the out-of-map ending, you break the game only for the narrator to tell you that you aren't nearly as smart as you think you are. He then asks you if you are sick of this gag, and hijinks ensue. The out-of-map ending really has the one shock moment.
At first, Stanley assumed he'd broken the map, until he heard this narration and realized it was part of the game's design all along.
But boy is it a good shock moment. It's far less effective the second time around, but it's so good the first time that all the times after are somewhat nostalgic in a way. It's genuinely so creative and out of the box, pun intended, to have one of the endings in a game about choice and power to be about you thinking you've broken the game only to have the narrator humble you. After that, you have 2 options, saying you're sick of the gag or not. I like the practically 5th wall-breaking monologue of the yes answer, but instead of the limerick inventory generator made by Irregularize, the little guitar song is just so perfect in my eyes.
There once was a man named Stanley, who people considered so manly.
I think this is an ending found by playtesting that really works. The bottom of the mind control facility ending with the bucket, or Bot McFutib for short, is strangely dark, but in a pretty good way. In this ending, you reach the bottom of the mind control facility with the bucket and start a mini life down there. After they live for a while, Stanley realizes he never learnt about the mind control facility, and his regrets make him upset. It really just ends at that point, but I think this ending is surprisingly good. It has some pretty interesting commentary on the priorities shifting between adapting to your current situation and dwelling on what should have been, with the bucket building comfort down at the bottom and Stanley letting his regrets eat at him. It gets unnerving and painfully realistic by the end, says the teenager. Also, I really like how there's never an explanation to how they got couches, a sink, and a TV down there. They just appear. All in all, I reckon Bot McFutib is pretty underrated. While it's only in the original game, the serious ending is honestly one of the funniest endings for me. If you try to turn on cheats in the original Stanley Parable, the narrator will send you to the serious room and scold you. He just says all these incredibly goofy things in an incredibly serious way, and even though I've never even gotten the ending in-game, it's one of the most memorable in my eyes.
As the understanding that of all tables I looked at, this one is the most serious.
Or what about this one?
Infinity years in the serious room.
That's such a Stanley Parable way to deal with cheaters, and hammers in the notion that the only choices you get are the narrators. The coward ending is just the apartment ending drastically abridged, but I do love the apartment ending. If you close the door in your office, the narrator describes you being too afraid to make decisions and gets you to wait for infinitely long. There's a running theme in this game of it being better to be an upstander rather than be a bystander, and this ending provides some really good arguments. The dimly lit office room is claustrophobic, immediately creating a drastic sense of isolation and foreboding. The terror in the time passing before your eyes is really effective in building up the idea that you made the wrong decision, alongside the narrator's way of speaking about Stanley's oblivious worldview. The wait and answers will come mentality has been something that I personally have hardwired myself against in day-to-day life, and I think it's mainly because of how chilling this ending is. The only problems it has is that it's kind of irrelevant because of the apartment ending, and it is really short, clocking in at a little over a minute. The new content is only a prelude to the much better sequel ending, but the story of the Ultra Deluxe wouldn't make any sense without it. A lot of the endings in the Ultra Deluxe about soulless cash grabs stem from here. In this ending, you find a new content door, and after stepping through, are treated to a short little ride recapping the Stanley Parable's financial success, and how you've reached the new content. This new content is 2 elevator rides, a jump circle, and a little whiteboard. The long elevator ride only to be greeted with a 4-word long message is really well done, and a jump circle does seem to be an automatic idea for new content despite not making any actual sense in the context of the original game. I like the idea of a board of executives saying, "The fans want more, they like the emotion and nuance, but you also couldn't jump, so let's make them jump," and then the board of executives all jump in unison shouting, "Huzzah!" and then laughing all the way to the bar. The other part of the ending I think is really pleasant is the narrator's teamwork with you. There are several times in the game where the narrator absolutely hates you, and so being able to have a connection in your confusion towards these features is really nice. But ultimately, this ending is just an introduction to the game and not much more. I really like the freedom ending, though I don't adore it as much as others. I do think it's the most important for obvious reasons though. This is the ending where you do what you are supposed to. You follow the narrator's lead, shut down the mind control facility, and are free. It's clear that the game would not function without this ending. It's very nice after torturing Stanley and the narrator, going through hell and back and reliving the same day hundreds of times, doing what you were supposed to do, and win. The cutscene is incredibly triumphant. Stanley can make his own decisions. He is completely free. So free that by the end, not even the player can control him. He can do literally whatever he wants with his life. That's nice. It's also interesting to see how the narrator treats controlling someone's actions as something morally reprehensible that Stanley should be completely against, despite telling Stanley exactly what to do the entire playthrough. It's a good stabilizer for the other endings, and it's great to come back to. The real person bucket ending is the first time on this list where I think the absurdist humour really worked. In this ending, you unplug the phone because the bucket tells you so. The narrator then tells you that the bucket isn't real and you can't take a joke. You then watch an instructional video that the narrator watches as well, so he can learn to get good comedic timing. You then go back, the timing goes all wrong, you continue to fail at jokes, and the narrator throws jokes at your lifeless husk for eternity, presumably. Most of the ending doesn't work that well for me, like the anger the narrator feels towards you not conforming to the joke rules, and the final part has a strange tone, like should I be afraid or laughing, which only sort of works, but that first section is hilarious. The idea of the narrator learning comedy is super creative and works very well in the context of the game, so that was a great starting premise. Also, the video might be the funniest part of the Ultra Deluxe for me. Something about the absolute nonsensical, hyper-specific requirements just perfectly scratches that itch for me. Humor is consistently considered to be the most subjective and indecipherable experience we humans go through, so to have this video tell you the exact structure, room temperature, and body language you should be using is hilarious. I've been trying for years to make
I'm Dunny with the funny
a part of me and my friends' culture, but to no avail. This ending has a weak narrative, but brilliant humor. Okay, so, with my aforementioned distaste towards most of this game's absurdist humor, I should really dislike the countdown bucket ending, right? I mean, you turn on the machine and then it just shows you pictures of silly birds and that's it. Surely I don't love this ending with all of my heart, right? Wrong! Silly birds became a part of my vocabulary and culture. I used to have a screenshot of this ending on a corkboard in my bedroom. I classified everything as silly birds. Birds fighting, silly birds. Bird flying, silly bird. Bird lying, silly bird. Illustration of a toucan, silly bird. Piece of machinery that vaguely looks like it has 2 wings, a head and legs. That is one silly goddamn bird. This ending is absolutely bonkers, and I love the fact that it's not trying to be anything at all. The infinite hole ending is about as ultra deluxe as it gets. You fall down a seemingly infinite hole, then reach the bottom. You then jump again and the bottom comes sooner. You do this a couple of times until the hole is a little more than a puddle. The narrator then just leaves you there, and you somehow get to... I'll see what sense I can make here. This could be a metaphor for how people reacted to the Stanley Parable. At first there seems to be infinite endings, infinite decisions, infinite ways to go down, but then you get to all the endings and get a bit disappointed. You can go back to them, enjoy them more, analyze them, but eventually you've milked the game for all of its enjoyment and there's no more game to enjoy. This is actually a very creative and effective way of saying that, if that is what the ending is going for, but then Stanley just... I'm definitely not saying that I dislike this turn of events. It's a slow burn comedy which I think has a lot of replayability, and it's great to show others out of context. I like the narrator's growing frustration for Stanley tarnishing his creation, and I think that could also be a reflection of the creator's opinion towards hyper-analysts. But then... I like this ending. It works well if you want to figure out what it means, or if you just want to, experience it. The Insanity Bucket ending, I think, has the best implementation of comedy out of all of the bucket endings. This one has both great themes and a comedic way of passing them on without compromising atmosphere or theming. Stanley goes downstairs with the bucket and then comes to the conclusion that he is mad. He asks the bucket for help, but after not finding reassurance with it, realizes that the bucket is not his. He then runs through the endless hallways looking for his bucket. Then he realizes that maybe the real bucket was inside him all along. Next thing we know, he's dead and Mariella is looking down at him. He realizes he didn't have his bucket, which explains why he lost his mind. Anyways, I like a whole lot about this ending. To be negative first, I think the way Stanley blacks out is kinda forced, and also while the general idea of losing the bucket is good, it's not as strong as the upcoming endings. But the comedy in this one is fantastic.
Am I crazy? He asked the bucket.
Like, that's really funny, and the exact comedy which I'd like to see coming from a bucket ending. Not only that, but the urgency is well translated from the original with the ticking clock aspect, but with a comedic twist on it that is used to perfection. I also love Mariella's speech at the end. That's the funniest and most insightful part of the ending. This line may be the greatest line in the Ultra Deluxe.
Heck yes, she thought to herself. My life kicks ass. And she backflipped all the way to work.
This probably has the best combination of insight, terror, and comedy out of any bucket ending, and I have to give it props for that, even if the plot isn't perfect. The Figurine Ending had a fantastic idea, but seemed to fall just a bit flat for me. The idea of an introspective look down memory lane, considering the creation of a story and all that, would be really satisfying and something that would work really well in the Stanley Parable. Unfortunately, I think the execution is a little flimsy here. Don't get me wrong, a lot of it is good, a lot of it is great even. The motif of finding comfort in the past is a great idea for a Stanley Parable ending, and the past steadily growing unfamiliar also works really well. The steady going back in time, allowing the narrator to reflect on why he truly created the story not for Stanley, but for himself, is also a great idea. The Windows Movie Maker loading screen going back and superliminal-esque call to action are all memorable and great. I really like the message of, I lost control of my life, so I made a new one where I had control, and I think that many players could take that to heart. I mean, why do we play video games after all? Unfortunately, there is a bit of a tell-don't-show mentality present. The narrator spends 3 minutes explaining the entire reason he came up with the game to begin with, and yeah, it's heartfelt, but it's less creative than the other endings. I find I end up liking it more in retrospect than execution. I mean, if that were on purpose, then that'd be absolutely insane. But as is, this is a fantastic idea, and has many great parts, but has a bit less emotion than it could have. The apartment bucket ending is surprisingly good, just barely beating the Insanity bucket ending. It'd be super easy to have this ending be a silly one where the narrator and Stanley fight over the bucket, but the tone here is really ominous and consistent. I adore the soundtrack too, just listen to this. In this ending, you answer the phone and start a life with the bucket. You get very attached to it, but the narrator is jealous and believes that the bucket is poisoning Stanley. He tries to convince you that it's bad for you, but it fails, and he starts seeing the bucket's merits. Eventually, the narrator himself becomes infatuated and starts yelling at Stanley for the bucket. This ending has a similar structure to the regular apartment one, with little bits of text telling you to press buttons and continue the story. These bits of text are paced out incredibly well and provide an interesting comparison to the narrator. He's sarcastic, but usually has at least somewhat good intentions for you. The bucket has a much more friendly and calm way of speaking to you, but its intentions are far more manipulative. I think that works super well as an allegory for abusive relationships, as well as working well for the intoxicating nature of power and the narrator's relationship with Stanley. Like, yeah, he hasn't been treating us very well. It makes sense that we'd immediately find solace in the bucket in a real-world scenario. I absolutely love this section. The environment is conducive to romance and connection, but ultimately it's dimly lit and has satanic parallels. I don't think the ending is perfect, specifically the narrator's writing could have used a bit of a touch-up.
This sort of shiny bucket. Well, I'll give it this. The bucket does have a nice shine to it.
But the idea, atmosphere, and the majority of the execution is really well done and a surprise gem. The elevator ending is just straight comedy. It's that one friend that takes the joke too far, but just really well done. Like, wow, going up and down on an elevator, super creative. I mean it. Give me time to process this. Here, let me help with your efforts. Follow me to this press conference. It's all for you to tell everyone about your amazing skills. It's the most sarcastic the narrator has ever been, and I love it. In real-world scenarios, this fits very well into the context of the player's situation. If someone has naturally gotten this ending, they've probably tried all other intuitive endings and are trying to find anything else of interest in this game they possibly can. By this point, they're probably not considering why something would be interesting, just testing random things like a robot. This is essentially just the narrator doing a consciousness check, reminding you that if you want to do dumb things, don't. Every sarcastic detail is really well picked. The posters of all the super important people in the conference room are absolutely gold. So are all the kind of letters from loved ones, including your wife from the apartment ending. The elevator slowdown is so genius, and a big screw you from the narrator. Yeah, I bet you thought you were wasting my time, huh? Well, two can play at that game. It's also exciting to explore different places, and the press conference is a really pretty new environment. Overall, there's not much wrong with this ending, it's just a well-composed series of middle fingers that are all hilarious. The Insanity ending is terrifying, both with its morals and the situation Stanley's in. It has a very different take to decision-making than most endings, with Stanley panicking under the pressure and wishing to go back to his monotonous life. In this episode of Stanley Torture, Stanley goes downstairs to the basement and realizes he's dreaming. He then becomes self-aware and realizes there's a voice in his head. He starts to think he's gone mad, screams into the void, dies, and another woman sees him lying on the pavement. This is another ending about control, and I think this one displays it in a very interesting way. As Stanley realizes more things about him that don't make sense, it becomes more clear that us being in control of his actions is a large problem. In the Mariella part near the end, she says, "I'm lucky to be in control of my own mind." Well, Stanley sure isn't in control of his. We have us controlling his actions and the narrator telling him what to think. Mariella realizes that she's sane and therefore is in control of her actions and should be happy about it. But even though she's sane, she has work responsibilities that tell her what to do. I think it's an interesting look at the definition of sanity, and also it's terrifying outside of that. The moment where Stanley spends a solid minute convincing himself that he's dreaming, only to open his eyes to the same thing as before, is one of the most helpless moments in the entire game. This ending is terrifying and pretty interesting to translate to the real world. I don't think the museum works quite as well for me as it does for others, but I do think that it's amazing. It has a feeling that really can't be replicated in any other ending, a sense of individualism, complete control, and yet unable to do anything at all. In this ending, you fall into a conveyor steadily approaching a metal crusher. As Stanley is about to be killed, a female narrator stops time and brings you to a museum. This museum has a lot of behind-the-scenes content. When you go back, the conveyor starts back up and you're a bit behind. The female narrator is begging you to restart the game. It's the only way Stanley will survive. He was dead from the start. And whether you restart the game yourself or you let the conveyor kill Stanley, you reach the end. If we look at the theming to start off with, this ending has a very interesting look at control. The narrator thinks he controls Stanley, and he does. However, you're not Stanley, you're a real person. This becomes very clear when time stops for Stanley and the narrator, but not for you and the female narrator. In a way, the female narrator is a guardian angel for the story, eventually begging you to do whatever you can to save them both. Despite all the narrator's guidance and Stanley being your vessel, the player is ultimately the only one in control. The atmosphere in this one is impeccable as well. The loud machinery is creepy, though not nearly as creepy as the sudden and prolonged silence as time stops and you fall into the museum. And the slow fade back to overbearing mechanical clanging is mortifying. This ending doesn't have the dramatic weight or engagement of others, but it is entirely unique and incredibly intriguing. I honestly don't want to speak too much about the real person ending, as I kind of feel a lot has already been said about it. This is another one that doesn't work as well for me as it does for others, but it also does have a unique style, somewhat similar to the museum ending. I think the reason these two stand out so well is the fact that these are the only two from the original game where we are in a position of power over the narrator. We are no longer a pet that does strange things that the narrator can complain about. We are a real thinking being that require reasoning and logic. And because of this, we become imperceptible to the narrator, and he loses his power over us. Only this time, we don't have the female narrator to guide us. The cuts directly in between the narrator's speeches and his hopeless tone of voice allow us to see a side of him we've never seen before. I find that super interesting. But as I said, there's been much discussion of this ending already, but not much on our next one. The game show ending is my favorite bucket ending by far. It's probably the second funniest ending in the game for me. In this ending, the narrator tells you that a section of the game you want to go to has a no bucket sign and questions whether you know what a bucket is. He then sets up a game show to test your knowledge on what is and isn't a bucket. Then you start discussing whether nothing can be a bucket, and the narrator gets so confused that he deletes all buckets and everything disappears except for him and Stanley. The humor in this one is absurd, but there's a logic to it, making gigantic leaps that technically make sense and fix the problem, but are also so out of the blue that it's just hilarious. No, that's not a bucket, that's a 3D recreation of a bucket. Oh, so you don't know what a bucket is? Here, let me set up an entire game show. This also makes the random disregard of logic all that more effective.
Correct. This is a tractor and not a bucket. Incorrect. This is a bucket.
Then it gets super surreal with the notion that if nothing is a bucket, then buckets don't exist or empty space can carry liquids. But if nothing isn't a bucket, then empty space isn't a bucket or everything is a bucket. It's just absolutely hilarious. I think by this point on the first playthrough, I couldn't breathe. The realization that everything but the narrator and Stanley was a bucket, it was also just a perfect cap-off. This isn't as ambitious as the upcoming ones, but jeez is it well executed. Despite being 9th, the broom closet ending is my favourite. You know how I said the game show ending was the second funniest ending? This is the funniest, by a landslide. In a game all about making life-altering choices, the most creative ending is the one where you make the least important choice of all. Just in case you don't know, in this ending, Stanley sits in a broom closet and the narrator scolds him for it. The pacing in this one is absolutely fantastic. It gradually goes from the narrator advising Stanley towards leaving, to being more pushy, to being confused, to being frustrated, to being aggressive. It's a very clever what-if concept. What if someone refused to make decisions in a game all about making decisions? Well, you get hilarious dialogue and a very interesting mechanic to reach the end. I love how meta this one gets, not only with the narrator assuming the player has died, but also with how you need to restart yourself and how your previous choices affect future runs. The silent board up of the closet is honestly just straight gold. And to add on to that, the narrator's acting is incredibly fantastic in this one. You can really see the confused hatred build up slowly. For some reason, this delivery just works so well.
Are you really still in the broom closet?
It's not easy to put into words because it's just comedy, the ending, but please watch or play this one if you haven't already. The countdown ending has a unique feeling like the museum and real person ending, but the polar opposite. In those ones, you're put in a position of power over the narrator. In this one, the narrator expresses his immense power over you. To get the countdown ending, you have to turn on the mind control machine. After this, the narrator will get angry and force a new story onto you, where the security system doesn't recognize Stanley and it sends nukes to his location. The narrator has an incredibly long monologue in this one, and basically every part of it is fantastic. It's all about how much the narrator despises you, how much he controls Stanley's being, how insignificant he is. He talks about how sometimes when he tells the Stanley Parable, he just allows everyone to die, which is a terrifying thought. His monologue actually changes on replays. The replay dialogue asks Stanley how many times he'll come back and try to solve an unsolvable puzzle, and actually mirrors the apartment dialogue.
And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And Stanley died again. and Stanley died again.
In fact, that's probably my favourite part about the ending. There is no solution. There are buttons and machinery and doors and a timer, and all of that implies that there is a way to turn off the nukes even though there's none. It's such a cold power move from the narrator and I love it. I for one actually had to search up online whether the timer could be stopped before stopping myself, but maybe that's just because I'm a fan of puzzle games. All in all, this ending probably has the most cinematic dialogue in the game, and I love the absolute sense of control present in all of the narrator's lines. I'm counting the game's ending as both versions, the Firewatch and Rocket League one, and also the Minecraft and Portal one. I'd put the Minecraft and Portal one higher just for personal bias, though both are incredible. The game's ending is so much fun, and has yet another interesting take on the nature of choice. In this one, once you let the baby die, the narrator realizes you probably just hate his game, so he picks a different one. After playing around with that one a bit, you try another game. After that, you find a way of escaping the narrator's grasp, but it's down in these dark beta rooms. This is the ending you get, where you disobey everything the narrator asks. He says go left, you go right. He says stay on the platform, you jump to the catwalk. He says keep the baby alive, you stay
Let it die, let it die.
And so, by the end, the narrator has this chilling monologue about how you win. You wanted individuality in your actions, and because of that, you're now put in unfamiliar scenarios all alone. The reason for that is that Stanley isn't making his own decisions in this ending, he's disobeying the narrator. He's doing the polar opposite of the narrator, regardless of what he wants to do. He's forcing independence onto himself, therefore making him isolated. I think that's a really cool way to look at decision making, not just in video games, but in real life too. It brings things like Teen Rebellion to mind, or the Streisand effect. Also, this is fantastically funny. If we looked at the original, the moment of realization as Minecraft loads in is fantastically timed, and the narrator's smugness when building the house is just so petty. Also, Portal. I just really like Portal, I thought it was a great choice. You can soft lock yourself on the first puzzle and then you just have to restart the game. Like, come on! This ending is super interesting, has fantastic humour, and was well laid out, with dark messages by the end as well. The sequel ending is an interesting choice to be this high, because it doesn't really have a good grasp on emotion. What it does have, however, is a whole lot of stuff. This ending is set after experiencing the new content ending. The narrator realizes that if he wants new content, he'll have to make it himself, and says that he has a bunch of small ideas that now might turn into a real game. Of these small ideas, every single one of them is great, but I have to say that the gym button, infinite hole, and balloons have to be the best additions. They're just so whimsical, fun, and lighthearted when compared to the other endings. The gym button especially is just hysterical. It's so on brand for this game, and I can't get enough of it. The whole ending has such an uplifting nature to it, which is such a breath of fresh air. You're no longer in an emotionless office or a basement or unfinished rooms. You're in a modern, sleek, wide-open convention center. The soundtrack here so perfectly fits the emotion that this ending has. Listen to this tidbit.
The Stanley Parable 2.
There are so many little details like the posters, papers on the ground, and signs that just make coming back here an absolute blast. The ending of the ending also isn't too bad. The narrator realizes that all of his ideas are just gags, and while they're good gags, they can't support a game on their own. And so it comes to this really satisfying revelation where he figures he'll just keep the game as is and tastefully add the elements in. It sets up the new content super well, and the ending itself is always fun to come back to. Holy crap guys, the demo ending is amazing! How did I not know about this? How did I not know it was free? How's there this much effective, logical, but absurd humor? How's there a genuinely chilling, fantastic monologue at the end? I hadn't even gotten the ending at the start of writing the script, but as soon as I went through it, I knew it needed to be added in. I kind of don't want to spoil it because there's a high chance that you watching this haven't played it. Pause this video for 15 minutes, download it on Steam, it's free, then come back. You'll understand. Okay, so first thing, the humor. The jokes in this one are so good, and so unexpected.
How fascinating. Did you know that 94% of all people who select that particular button are sexual predators? Please step into the dance perimeter. Please perform a dance.
It's completely random, and because it breaks the static demo tone so well, it works in context. This is meant to be a prelude to the Stanley Parable after all, god of game breaking. Each of the exhibits are hilarious as well, not a single bad one. It's even better than the sequel ending in that regard. The demo manages to carry the sudden, fast-paced energy from the real game into the adventure here, where you need to find the demo. This energy passes through each part so well, from the 8 button to the conclusion coming first to the whole game breaking due to a malfunction, and then it all comes to this serene halt in the isolation chamber. Warning, if you're listening to this and haven't played the demo, do it right now, it will be spoiled. So the narrator starts discussing the memories he and Stanley have made together, but he slowly starts talking about memories they haven't even made yet, all in an incredibly dreamlike manner. You're transported to all the locations he talks about as though he's imagining you in a story he's making, and he eventually talks about his memory of being free and outside. But you aren't transported there. Instead, the elevator door opens up to Stanley's office. Oh my god, this ending is so good. So unexpectedly fantastic. The Zending is, in my opinion, the saddest ending in the Stanley Parable and probably the most disturbing. In this one, you're taken to this truly beautiful, happy place, but if you want the story to keep progressing, you have to reset. The way you do this is by throwing yourself off of a stairway several times. In fact, in the Ultra Deluxe version, you seemingly hurt or break your legs, and so you're more crawling towards the top of the stairway by the end. This ending is absolutely brutal and yet ingenious. As a video game player, you have to keep the story going. You don't really want to stay in one place for very long, just letting the game sink in, because new exciting stuff is just around the corner. This is amplified in this ending. What we want to do is keep the story progressing, but to the narrator, it seems like we're doing everything in our power to stop him being happy, ruining his projects while we're at it. Funnily enough, there are some parallels to Undertale in this regard. At the end of the pacifist route, you're begged by Flowey to leave the characters as they are, because they're happy. Logically speaking, however, you know that they're fictional and you should just restart. But that doesn't change the fact that you are attached to these characters, and while it's better to keep playing, it hurts being mean to these characters and them not understanding why. In the Zending, the narrator perfectly conveys this. There's a sense of confused panic as you walk up the stairs, with the narrator saying it'll restart, he'll have to leave this place. When you do it again, the narrator is less panicked, but more confused about why you're doing this. By the last couple of times, the narrator is completely dejected, knowing he can't do anything to stop you. Too caught up in the sadness of losing the only thing he loved to even hate you. I think this ending could be about how change is the only constant, or how happiness is temporary, or maybe it's just about the nature of story progression. I don't really care what it is, because whichever one, this ending is a masterpiece. The apartment ending is the most terrifying ending once you translate it into a real-world scenario, in my opinion. There's no happy endings whatsoever, no sad endings, just harsh reality weighing down on each character like a reverse safety blanket. Stanley lives a life of boredom. The narrator fruitlessly tries to stop Stanley. The player has an existential crisis. In this ending, you get to the apartment and the narrator pranks you into thinking you had a wife. He then starts telling you
A very sad story about the death of a man named Stanley.
In this story, Stanley has a boring job but imagines himself going on adventures where his choices make differences to his life. However, the narrator tells us that he isn't making a real difference, just an imaginary one. Throughout this, Stanley's apartment starts turning into his office. By this point, the narrator continually tells Stanley not to press buttons, to which Stanley continually ignores him. The end. There is a lot to look at here. First off, the players themselves. When you're playing the Stanley Parable, yes, you're going on adventures, but you're really just pressing buttons, not moving at all, not making a true difference to the trajectory of your life. By playing the Stanley Parable, you are escaping a real world that has a day-in, day-out school, work, or home life, and going to a fictional world where your choices change reality itself. But they aren't. You're just pretending like they are. This ending could easily be a reflection of the player's motives for playing the game, and this is my favorite interpretation of it. Or maybe it could be a reflection of how being a bystander and complacent in life is easy, but it makes your life very low quality. Or maybe it's about the terrors of working in a large corporation office job. I truly don't know, and that's half the fun. Also, the execution is probably my favorite in any ending, including the top 2. You get prompts to press buttons for incredibly generic actions, proving you're living life on autopilot, but you have to keep the story going, like in the Zending. The peaceful silence of these messages is absolutely chilling, especially as their malicious intent becomes more and more obvious. The apartment morphing is incredibly subtle at first, but the truth dawns on you along with the office, which is just perfectly executed. This ending is a chilling mirror to the player's life, and by God, it's presented in the most effective way possible. Oh my goodness, the confusion ending is incredible. And the best part about it is I have no idea why it's so good. It doesn't have the most potent emotion, the most insightful wisdom, the absolute greatest humor, but it is almost the best in all of these. That might be what makes it so good. Or maybe it's the adventurous feeling exploring new parts of the facility and breaking past resets. Or maybe it's the narrator and Stanley working together to fix their problems. Or maybe it's the fact that it makes fun of other video games in a very valid and understandable way. Or maybe being confused is really just that fun. In this ending, you go down through the maintenance section, and the narrator gets lost as to where the story is meant to be going. So, you restart the game, and now more confusing stuff is happening. So you restart the game again, and now there's no options. You restart a third time and follow the adventure line TM down a pathway with epic music in the background, and then the line goes away, but it comes back, and this ending is pure chaos, and I love it. Every single second of it. This ending has two main themes, I think. One of them being about the mollycoddling present in a lot of modern games, and the other being about free will. If we look at the gaming one first, the line TM is a pretty obvious parallel to the unnecessary guidance in many open world games, with quotation marks. This was popularized semi-recently with the yellow paint meme, and yep, you guessed it, the line TM is yellow. Not only this, but Stanley and the narrator share a distaste towards the promise of adventure, contrasted with what they actually get, which is pretty boring. Kinda like buying the new $60 Ubisoft game only to realize the open world is really just a set of corridors. The second theme is very interestingly portrayed. This whole ending is as unexpected as it gets. As soon as you think you know what's about to happen, the game throws you a curveball. Oh, you're being given too many choices? Take no choices at all. Oh, you're getting bored? Here's some out-of-place music to fill the silence. It makes the whole ending feel like you accidentally broke the game and are trying desperately to stick it back together without breaking it more. But when we finally get to the end, the big twist comes to shine when it's revealed that this whole time, we've been in a scripted ending and all of the chaos and reckless decisions were pre-made. In retrospect, it's a dystopian, ominous concept, but in-game, it works super well comedically. All of the indecipherable nonsense was just pre-written and had no cipher at all to crack it. And once the narrator realizes he's been scripted and decides against it, the in-game timer stops and all the progress is reset. I just think that's the only way this path could have feasibly ended, and I'm so glad this wasn't overly drawn out as long as it could have been. All in all, this ending is pure chaos with fantastic humor, interesting themes that fit seamlessly in, and is more memorable than almost every other ending despite being 5 times longer than others. And yet it pales in comparison to number 1. The skip button ending was always going to be at the top. It won by a mile. I instinctively put it at the top when writing the script. As soon as I heard about the concept, my subconscious knew that it was going to be my favorite. It combines undeniably fantastic themes with more situational terror than any other ending, alongside great humor, background details, voice acting, pacing, and it also has topics that I like personally. This ending is probably in my top 3 favorite gaming experiences of all time. In this ending, the narrator reflects on how much people love the original Stanley Parable, but after reading negative reviews, starts feeling desperate for these people's respect. In order to do this, he feels one player's wish for a skip button to skip over the narrator's ramblings. The narrator then makes this for Stanley, and he uses it a couple of times. However, the time Stanley is paused exponentially increases. It goes from a couple of minutes to a bit over half an hour to 12 hours to a week. As more time passes, the narrator is left alone in the room for longer and longer. He slowly starts to go insane, becoming excessive over the reviews, being left in depressive ruts, and the environment dying around him. Eventually, he's completely silent, even when Stanley comes back and after he escapes. So, first things first, I love time in horror. It is by far the most inescapable and terrifying concept that our mortal human minds cannot handle, and this ending executes it perfectly. I talked a little bit about this in the White Christmas video as well, and I calculated the time there. Here it's a bit harder to figure out, but we can assume it's probably about 13 billion years by the end. If we look at the character's progression, the narrator goes from sane to afraid to hopeless to silent to a kind of mental breakdown, and then silence again. The way this is portrayed from only his text is very impressive and disturbing. The narrator has been a very solid, unwavering friend thus far. He's been very articulate, sure of his own mind, always speaking to us even in his darkest moments. So to see him rambling on incoherently, not even noticing Stanley, is a real sign that this is worse than anything else beforehand. This is expertly amplified by his continuous
The end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end,
which might be the most disturbing moment in the entire game. The dark lighting, the low voice, the pure yet dampened insanity present. Seeing this torture break the narrator is awful, but so effective. The environment is also a great reflection of that. The technology starts deteriorating, the nature starts dying, the room starts collapsing. There's a brief moment of peace and tranquility, but we skip straight past it into some analog horror level sound design. Situational terror is the greatest, isn't it? But now I think we should talk about the theme, which is going to be difficult. I think it's probably a representation of letting other people's opinions dictate your actions and how you can't cater to everyone. It could also be a proof that since Stanley only exists in the story doesn't function if Stanley ignores it. Or maybe it's another piece of commentary about video games and attention spans, how much you harm the story when you skip over the important details. I mean, we are in the memory zone, so getting stuck in the past has got to be part of it, right? My theory is that this ending is about how beautiful it is to explore what you've already done with rose-tinted shades, but doing this means you'll dig up bad memories. And once you uncover bad memories, it's easy to get stuck in your own mind like a room without a door on an endless loop of self-reflection. But again, I'm honestly not sure. And because I don't know, I get to think about this ending over and over and over again, which is reward enough in itself. This ending is full to the absolute brim. Situational terror, psychological terror, introspective and personalized theming, amazing visuals, charming details, and a chilling atmosphere that is recreated in so few gaming experiences. And so it was always going to be top of the list for me. Well, that's about all I have. If you're up to this point, you probably enjoy the Stanley Parable a lot, or you're just really good at listening people ramble on and on. But either way, thank you for watching. Or maybe you've skipped straight to the outro, in which case there's literally an ending in this game detailing why that's a bad thing. Interestingly enough, I talked about the Stanley Parable a little bit in a video I made over 11 months ago. Let's play a clip from that now.
It's definitely going to appear more in this
Sorry, we're not going to play that anymore. This video was super fun to script. There's really only 2 to 3 endings in this entire game that aren't interesting, and it was great to replay each of the endings and rediscover how amazing it was. The Ultra Deluxe just has a few too many endings that get on my nerves, but the original would honestly be one of the 6 games I'd give a 10 out of 10. If you enjoy logic, there's endings for that. If you enjoy emotion, there's endings for that. If you enjoy horror, there's endings for that. Nothing not to enjoy, really. Anywho, despite the fact that the end is never the end, thanks for watching, walk through the red door, cue the outro music.
Good job, you did it. Good job,